Chapter 1. You knew something was off, you just didn't have the words for it yet. You could feel it in conversations where you were saying everything that sounded right, everything that should have made sense, everything that was supposed to land, and still something in the air stayed flat. You'd walk away from those interactions replaying what you said, checking your tone, wondering if you missed something small that could have changed the whole direction. It wasn't confusion in the moment, it showed up after, when the energy didn't carry forward the way you thought it would. And deep down, there was this quiet realization building that it wasn't about one sentence or one moment. It was something about how you were showing up altogether. You were easy to talk to, and people told you that all the time, which made it even harder to see what was missing. You made things comfortable, you made sure the other person felt heard, and you moved through conversations like you were trying to keep everything steady. That steadiness felt like a strength because it avoided conflict, avoided awkwardness, avoided anything that could create tension. You thought that was the foundation of connection, keeping things smooth so nothing could go wrong. But what you didn't notice was how that same smoothness removed something essential that you couldn't quite define yet. You've probably been there yourself, where you're doing everything that sounds right in your head and still not getting the response you expected. You're paying attention, you're being respectful, you're not overstepping anything. And somehow, the interaction still feels like it's missing weight. It doesn't stick, it doesn't build, it just moves along and fades without leaving anything behind. That's the part that messes with you, because it doesn't feel like you did anything wrong. It just feels like something didn't connect, even though you can't point to where it fell apart. Back then, you didn't question your approach, you questioned the situation instead. You told yourself maybe it was the wrong person, maybe the timing was off, maybe something external was getting in the way. That explanation felt easier because it didn't require you to look at yourself in a different way. It let you keep moving the same way you always had, hoping that eventually things would line up differently. But the pattern kept repeating, and the more it repeated, the harder it became to ignore. The truth started showing itself in small moments you didn't expect, not in big situations, but in subtle differences you began noticing. You'd watch how someone else interacted in the same space, and something about it felt different even if you couldn't explain it clearly. The way they spoke wasn't necessarily better, the words weren't more intelligent, and yet the reaction they got carried more energy. That observation stayed with you longer than it should have because it didn't match what you believed about how things were supposed to work. And once you saw it, you couldn't stop seeing it. You began realizing that the version of yourself you thought was your best version might have been holding something back without you knowing it. Not in an obvious way, not like you were hiding something intentionally, but in the way you filtered everything before it came out. There was a layer between what you actually thought and what you chose to say, and that layer was built around making sure everything stayed acceptable. That filter felt responsible, it felt mature, it felt like the right way to move, but it was also limiting the way people experienced you. That limitation didn't show up as rejection, which is why it took longer to notice. It showed up as neutrality, as interactions that stayed in a safe space and never moved beyond it. People were comfortable around you, but comfort alone didn't create the kind of connection you were looking for. It created familiarity, it created ease, but it didn't create that pull that makes someone want to stay engaged longer than they need to. That difference is subtle, but once you start seeing it, it becomes impossible to ignore. You didn't learn this all at once. It came together slowly as you paid attention to your own patterns. The way you spoke, the way you adjusted yourself mid-conversation, the way you avoided moments that felt uncertain. All of it added up to a version of you that was controlled in a way that felt normal because you'd been doing it for so long. That control kept things stable, but it also kept things contained, and contained energy doesn't move. If you're hearing this and something feels familiar, like you've been in that same position without realizing it, that's exactly how it starts. It's not something you notice immediately, it's something you recognize. After seeing the same outcome enough times, go ahead and drop a comment if you've ever walked away from an interaction thinking everything went fine, but still felt like something was missing, because that feeling is more common than people admit. And if this is already shifting how you're thinking about your own experiences, hit the like button so more people who've been stuck in that same pattern can start seeing it for what it is. You didn't need someone to tell you that something had to change. You were already feeling it. The difference now is that you're starting to understand where that feeling was coming from. And once you see it clearly, you can't go back to moving the same way without noticing it every time. That awareness is where everything starts shifting, not because you're trying to become someone else, but because you're finally seeing what you've been doing the whole time. Chapter 2. You remember exactly how it felt, even if you didn't understand it at the time, because moments like that stick in a way that doesn't fade easily. You were sitting across from her, the conversation moving in that same steady rhythm you had gotten used to. Everything polite, everything smooth, everything predictable. You were listening closely, responding thoughtfully, making sure nothing you said created any kind of friction, because in your mind, that was how things were supposed to go. She smiled, she engaged, she stayed present, and from the outside, it looked like everything was working. But there was something underneath it that you couldn't quite name, something that felt like it wasn't building, even though nothing was going wrong. You noticed it in the way the conversation never took a turn you didn't expect, how every response felt like it stayed within a certain range. There was no moment where you had to react without thinking, no point where the energy shifted in a way that caught you off guard. It all felt controlled, and at the time, you took that as a sign that things were going well. You told yourself that consistency and comfort were exactly what you were supposed to create, that if everything stayed steady, it meant you were doing something right. But when you look back on it now, you realize that the lack of movement was the signal you missed. At some point during that interaction, someone else joined the conversation, and you remember how quickly the dynamic changed without anyone acknowledging it directly. He didn't sit the way you were sitting, didn't speak with the same measured tone, didn't pause to make sure every word landed perfectly. He jumped into the conversation like it was already moving, like he didn't need permission to be part of it, and that alone shifted the energy in a way you felt immediately. The conversation started bending around him instead of staying in that straight line you'd been maintaining, and suddenly there was a sense of unpredictability that hadn't been there before. You watched it happen in real time, the way her attention moved, the way her reactions changed, the way the interaction started carrying more weight without becoming uncomfortable. It wasn't louder, it wasn't more aggressive, it was just less controlled, and that difference created something you hadn't been creating at all. You felt it in your chest before you understood it in your mind, that subtle awareness that something was happening that you couldn't replicate with the way you had been approaching things. And instead of stepping into that shift, you stayed where you were, holding on to the version of yourself that felt safe. After that, you did what you always did when something didn't make sense. You tried to adjust without fully understanding what needed to change. You became more attentive, more present, more focused on making sure the interaction stayed smooth. You thought maybe you just needed to bring more into the conversation, maybe you needed to show more interest, maybe you needed to be even more consistent in how you showed up. But every adjustment you made stayed inside the same structure, and that structure was the very thing limiting everything. What you didn't see at the time was how much you were holding yourself back in small ways that added up over the entire interaction. Every time you chose the safer response instead of the honest one, every time you softened something before saying it, every time you avoided a moment that could have shifted the energy, you were reinforcing the same pattern. It didn't feel like holding back because it felt like being thoughtful, But that thoughtfulness was creating a version of you that didn't fully exist in the moment. It was a version that had already been shaped before it even showed up. You remember leaving that situation feeling confused in a way that stuck with you longer than it should have. It wasn't frustration exactly. It was more like a quiet awareness that something about the way you were moving wasn't working the way you thought it was. You couldn't point to anything that went wrong, but you also couldn't say that anything meaningful had happened. That empty space between those two things is where the realization started forming, even if you didn't have the language for it yet. It took time before you understood what you were actually seeing, because it required you to look at yourself in a way you hadn't before. You had to recognize that being liked wasn't the same as creating something that people feel, and that difference doesn't come from effort or intention alone. It comes from how much of yourself is actually present in the interaction, how much you allow things to unfold without trying to keep them inside a certain range. That's not something you can fake, and it's not something you can force once you realize you've been holding on to control. That moment didn't change everything immediately, but it stayed with you long enough to start shifting how you saw your own behavior. You started noticing the same pattern in other situations, in conversations that felt similar, in interactions that ended the same way. And once you saw it clearly, it became impossible to ignore, because you realized it had been there the entire time, shaping everything without you knowing it. Chapter 3. You didn't flip a switch and suddenly become someone else. And that's the part that throws people off when they hear about change like this. It wasn't a transformation where you woke up one day with a completely different personality or a new way of speaking that replaced everything you used to do. It was quieter than that, more uncomfortable at first, because it required you to stay in moments you used to smooth over without thinking. You began noticing the exact point where you would normally adjust yourself, that split second where you would filter something before saying it. And instead of following that pravichka, you let the moment exist as it was. That felt strange in the beginning because you were used to keeping everything inside a certain range, and stepping outside of that range made you feel exposed in a way you hadn't experienced before. You started catching yourself in real time, not after the interaction was over, but while it was happening, which changed everything about how you experienced conversations. Instead of being slightly outside the moment, watching yourself and adjusting as you went, you were actually inside it, reacting as things unfolded instead of shaping them ahead of time. That shift didn't make every interaction perfect, and there were moments that felt rough, moments that didn't land the way you expected, moments where you would have previously stepped in to correct things. But you stayed in those moments instead of fixing them, and something new began happening because of that. The energy started moving in ways you weren't used to, not always smoothly, but in a way that felt real instead of controlled. Conversations had turns you couldn't predict, and instead of trying to guide them back into something comfortable, you followed where they went. That created tension in some moments, curiosity in others, and a sense that something was actually happening instead of everything staying within a narrow band of predictability. You began noticing how people responded differently when they couldn't anticipate exactly what you were going to say next, when the interaction carried a kind of openness that wasn't being managed. What surprised you most was how much of your old behavior had nothing to do with who you were and everything to do with how you were trying to be received. You weren't being fake, but you were constantly shaping yourself in small ways to make sure the interaction stayed safe. That safety came at a cost you hadn't recognized because it removed the parts of you that didn't fit neatly into that structure. Those parts are what create movement, what create tension, what makes someone lean in instead of just staying comfortable. As you let those parts come through, you notice something shift in how you felt about the interaction itself. You weren't focused on whether things were going well in the same way, because you weren't measuring every moment against a desired outcome. You were simply in it, responding to what was happening instead of trying to guide it somewhere specific. That made everything feel lighter, even when the conversation took an unexpected turn, because you weren't carrying the responsibility of making it go a certain way. There were still moments where the old pattern tried to come back, where you felt that urge to adjust, to smooth something over, to bring the interaction back into a familiar rhythm. You recognize those moments now, and instead of following them automatically, you paused and let them pass. That pause created space, and in that space, a different response emerged, one that wasn't shaped by the need to control how things were received. Over time, those pauses became less necessary because the new way of moving through conversations started becoming natural. You also began noticing how much more present you felt, not just in conversations, but in the way you moved through everything. There was less internal noise, less constant checking, less of that background process running while you were trying to engage with someone. That clarity made everything feel more direct, more immediate, and more connected to what was actually happening instead of what you thought should be happening. It was a different experience entirely, even though nothing about the external situation had changed. People responded to that in ways that were subtle but consistent, and you could feel it without needing anyone to explain it. Conversations lasted longer, reactions carried more weight, and there was a sense of engagement that hadn't been there before. It wasn't about saying better things or having better timing. It was about the fact that you were actually there, not partially outside the moment managing it. That presence created something that couldn't be replicated through effort, because it came from removing effort in the places where it didn't belong. Once you felt that difference, it became impossible to ignore how much your previous approach had been limiting everything without you realizing it. You weren't lacking anything before, you were just holding too tightly to a way of moving that kept everything contained. Letting go of that didn't make things chaotic, it made them real, and that reality is what people respond to when they feel something instead of just experiencing something. Chapter 4. You start seeing it everywhere once you've felt the shift inside yourself, and that's the part that almost feels unsettling at first. Conversations you used to have without thinking about them begin looking completely different, like you're watching them from a new angle that reveals everything you were missing before. You notice how often people are slightly outside the moment, adjusting themselves, choosing responses that feel safe instead of real, guiding the interaction instead of letting it move. It's not something you judge anymore because you recognize it as something you were doing without even knowing it. But the contrast becomes obvious, and once you see it, you can't go back to experiencing conversations the same way. You'll be talking to someone and feel that familiar pattern coming from them, the careful responses, the slight hesitation before they say something that could go either way. You can sense how they're shaping the interaction, how they're trying to keep everything within a certain range so nothing feels uncomfortable. And because you're no longer doing that yourself, you feel the difference immediately, like you're inside the moment while they're just outside of it. That gap changes the energy, not in a way that creates distance, but in a way that makes the interaction feel uneven. You realize how much of connection comes from both people being present in the same way at the same time. At the same time, you begin noticing how people respond to you differently without you having to do anything extra. There's a kind of attention that comes with being fully in the moment, a way people engage with you that feels more direct, more focused, more involved. It's not louder, it's not exaggerated, it's just more real. And that reality draws people in because it's not something they experience all the time. Most interactions are filtered, controlled, slightly managed, and when that layer's removed, it stands out without needing to be highlighted. You also start understanding why the version of you that you thought was your best version never created the results you were expecting. It wasn't lacking effort or intention, it was carrying too much structure, too much control, too much awareness of how everything was being received. That awareness created a kind of distance between you and the moment, even though you were physically present. You were always slightly behind your own words, checking them as they came out, adjusting them before they fully existed. That process made everything feel smoother, but it also made everything feel contained. Now that you're moving differently, you notice how much easier it is to let moments develop without stepping in. You don't feel that same urgency to correct things, to guide them, to make sure everything stays on track. If something shifts, you move with it instead of trying to bring it back, and that flexibility creates a kind of flow that wasn't there before. Conversations become less about maintaining a certain feeling and more about experiencing whatever shows up in real time. That difference is subtle from the outside, but it changes everything about how the interaction feels. There are still moments where things don't land perfectly, where the conversation dips or takes a turn that doesn't lead anywhere. And you notice those moments without reacting to them the way you used to. Before, you would have stepped in immediately, trying to fix it, trying to bring it back into a comfortable space. Now, you let it exist, and most of the time, it passes on its own without needing your intervention. That alone removes a huge amount of pressure because you're no longer responsible for making every moment work. What you begin to understand is that connection isn't built by removing every imperfect moment. It's built by allowing those moments to exist without disrupting the flow. The imperfections create texture, they create movement, they create something that feels alive instead of controlled. When everything is smooth all the time, there's nothing for the interaction to build on, nothing for it to move through. When there's variation, when there's unpredictability, the interaction starts carrying weight because it isn't being held in place. And as this becomes your natural way of moving, you stop thinking about it entirely, which is when it becomes most effective. You're no longer trying to apply something or remember something, you're just responding to what's happening in front of you. That kind of presence can't be faked because it comes from removing the need to perform in the first place. It's simple in a way that feels almost too easy once you understand it, but it took you a long time to get there because you were holding on to something that felt necessary at the time. Now, when you look back at how you used to move, it doesn't feel wrong. It just feels limited. You were working within a structure that made sense to you then, and it got you certain results, but it couldn't take you any further because it kept everything contained. Letting go of that didn't give you something new. It gave you access to what was already there, underneath all the adjustments and filters you had built over time. Chapter 5. It shows up in the quiet moments more than anywhere else, not when everything is flowing and easy, but when there's a pause that used to make you uncomfortable. You'll be sitting there, maybe across from her, maybe walking beside her, and there's a gap in the conversation that your old self would have rushed to fill. You can feel that old impulse still sitting somewhere in the background, like a reflex that hasn't completely disappeared. But now you don't move on it. You let the silence stretch just a little longer than feels natural, and something different starts to happen inside that space. The moment doesn't collapse the way you used to think it would. It actually expands, and you can feel her become more aware of you instead of less. That awareness is subtle, but it carries weight, because it shifts the focus from what's being said to what's being felt. You're no longer relying on constant words or constant movement to keep the interaction alive, and that creates a kind of gravity that wasn't there before. She starts paying attention in a different way, not because you did something impressive, but because you didn't break the moment when it had the chance to deepen. You let it breathe, and in that space, she begins to fill in the gaps with her own thoughts, her own curiosity, her own attention. That's something you could never create by trying harder, because it comes from not interfering when the moment is doing the work for you. You start to realize how often you used to interrupt that process without knowing it. How many times you stepped in right before something could develop into something real. You would say something to keep things going, to keep things smooth, to keep things comfortable, and in doing that, you removed the chance for anything to actually build. Now you can see those moments clearly, and instead of stepping in, you stay still. And that stillness carries more presence than anything you could have added. It's not about doing less in a passive way. It's about allowing the moment to unfold without cutting it short. There's a confidence in that kind of stillness that doesn't need to be announced, because it shows up in how you hold yourself without reacting to every shift. You're not chasing the next thing to say. You're not scanning for what to do next. You're just there, fully engaged with what's already happening. That kind of presence changes how you experience everything, because you're no longer trying to manage the interaction from the outside. You're inside it, moving with it, letting it take its natural shape instead of forcing it into something familiar. And the more you stay in that space, the more natural it becomes, until it doesn't feel like a choice anymore. You don't think about whether you should speak or stay quiet. You don't weigh every response before it comes out. You just respond when it feels right and stay still when it doesn't. That rhythm creates something that feels grounded, something that feels steady without being rigid. It's a different kind of control, one that doesn't come from managing every detail, but from trusting the moment enough to let it develop on its own. You also notice how much more you enjoy the interaction itself, because you're not carrying the pressure of making it go a certain way. You're not measuring every moment against an outcome. You're not trying to move things forward at a certain pace. You're just experiencing what's there. That shift makes everything feel lighter, even when there's tension or uncertainty, because you're not resisting those parts of the interaction. You're allowing them to exist, and that allowance creates a kind of ease that wasn't available before. At some point, you realize that what you thought was confidence before was actually control. And what you're experiencing now is something deeper than that. It doesn't come from knowing what to say or how to act. It comes from being comfortable with whatever happens when you stop trying to control it. That comfort shows up in ways you can't fake, in how you move, how you speak, how you respond, and how you don't respond. It's consistent in a way that doesn't need to be maintained, because it's not something you're performing. You can probably feel the difference just reading this, because you've been in those moments where you overthought everything, where you tried to keep things perfect, where you felt like you had to maintain a certain image to keep the interaction going. And you've also felt those rare moments where everything just flowed without effort, where you weren't thinking about what to do next, where things felt natural without you trying to make them that way. That second feeling isn't random, and it isn't something reserved for certain situations. It's something you can step into by letting go of the habits that keep you outside the moment. If this is hitting you in a way that feels familiar, like you're recognizing parts of yourself in it, then you already know where you've been holding on too tightly. You don't need to overanalyze it or turn it into something complicated. You just need to notice those moments and let them play out differently than you're used to. That's where the shift happens, not in a big change all at once, but in those small decisions to stay present instead of stepping in. And if you want to keep building on this, if you want to keep sharpening that awareness and seeing how far it can take you, go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss the next time we go deeper into this. Because once you start seeing it, you're going to keep noticing it everywhere. There's nothing flashy about it, nothing that looks impressive from the outside, but the impact is real in a way that doesn't need to be explained. You're not becoming someone else. You're removing the layers that were keeping you from being fully there in the first place. And once those layers start falling away, everything changes in a way that feels simple, but carries more weight than anything you were trying to do before.